On a crisp autumn morning in 2023, the bustling corridors of Metropolitan General Hospital were already alive with activity. The sun had barely peeked through the windows when one of the hospital's most distinguished surgeons stepped into the building, his white coat perfectly pressed and his mind focused on the challenging day ahead. This surgeon wasn't just any doctor. He was known throughout the medical community for his exceptional skills in cardiothoracic surgery. Having performed over 1,000 successful operations in his 15-year career, he carried himself with quiet confidence. His colleagues often spoke about his humble nature despite his impressive achievements, including graduating at the top of his class from a prestigious medical school and pioneering several innovative surgical techniques. That morning, he had arrived earlier than usual to review the files of his scheduled patient, a 62-year-old grandfather of 5 who desperately needed a complex heart valve replacement. The patient's condition had been deteriorating rapidly over the past few weeks, and this surgery was his last hope. As the surgeon studied the patient's charts in his office, he sipped his morning coffee and carefully went through each detail one more time. The operation would be particularly challenging due to the patient's unusual heart structure and previous medical complications. But these were exactly the kind of cases that drove him to excel in his field. The pre-operation routine began like any other day. He met with the patient and his family, explaining the procedure with patience and compassion. He had a way of breaking down complex medical terms into simple explanations that put anxious families at ease. The patient's wife, fighting back tears, squeezed his hand in gratitude as he assured them he would do everything in his power to help. In the scrub room, he methodically washed his hands and arms, a ritual he had performed thousands of times before. The familiar scent of antiseptic filled the air as he prepared himself mentally for the hours ahead. His surgical team, who had worked with him for years, moved around him with practiced efficiency, each person knowing their role perfectly. The operating room hummed with the soft beeping of monitors and the subtle sounds of medical equipment being prepared. The surgeon glanced at the clock, 7:45 a.m., right on schedule. As he entered the operating room, the cool air hit his face, and he nodded to his team. The anesthesiologist had already begun their work, and the patient lay peacefully on the operating table. "Time to begin," he said calmly, his voice carrying its usual reassuring tone. The scrub nurse handed him his first instrument, and the procedure began. Little did he know that this routine morning would soon turn into one of the most challenging days of his career. As he made the initial incision, his mind was focused solely on the intricate procedure ahead. The operating room fell into its familiar rhythm, the steady beep of the heart monitor, the soft whir of machinery, and the occasional request for instruments. The surgeon's hands moved with precision, each motion calculated and purposeful. The first hour of surgery progressed smoothly. The team worked in perfect synchronization, anticipating each other's needs without words. Through the protective surgical mask, the surgeon's eyes showed intense concentration as he navigated the complex procedure. The patient's vital signs remained stable, and everything was proceeding exactly as planned. None of them could have predicted how drastically this ordinary morning would change in the next few moments. As the critical phase of the operation approached, none of the medical professionals in that room had any inkling that they were about to become part of a story that would shake the medical community and spark a national conversation about prejudice, professionalism, and human dignity. The calm before the storm was about to break, and the events that would unfold in the next few hours would test not only the surgeon's professional skills, but also his personal strength in ways he had never imagined. But for now, in these last peaceful moments, his mind remained focused on just one thing: saving his patient's life. The tension in the room naturally began to build as they approached the most delicate part of the procedure, the actual valve replacement. The surgeon's experienced hands remained steady, his concentration unwavering. The patient's life literally hung in the balance, with his chest open and heart exposed, when fate decided to throw an unprecedented challenge their way. The peaceful rhythm of the operating room was suddenly shattered by the sound of the door swinging open. 3 police officers walked in, their boots squeaking against the sterile floor. The surgical team froze in disbelief, their eyes wide above their surgical masks. This was unprecedented. No one ever entered an operating room during surgery without proper sterilization procedures. "Sir, we have a warrant for your arrest," announced the lead officer, holding up a piece of paper. "You need to come with us immediately." The surgeon's hands remained perfectly steady above his patient's open chest cavity. Without looking up from his work, he spoke in a controlled voice. "Officers, I'm in the middle of open-heart surgery. My patient's life depends on this procedure being completed. I cannot stop." The tension in the room became thick enough to cut with a scalpel. The anesthesiologist exchanged worried glances with the surgical nurses, while the heart monitor continued its steady beeping, a reminder of the life hanging in the balance. "This isn't a request, doctor," the officer insisted, taking a step forward. "We have reports of an assault at Wilson's Pharmacy last night. Witnesses described someone matching your description." The chief surgical nurse found her voice. "Officers, please understand, you're compromising the sterility of this operating room. This patient is extremely vulnerable right now." But the officers stood their ground. The second officer, younger than the first, shifted uncomfortably but maintained his stern expression. "We understand the situation, but we have our orders. The suspect needs to be brought in immediately." The surgeon took a deep breath, his focus never wavering from his patient. "I was here at the hospital last night, working late on emergency cases. There are security cameras and multiple witnesses who can verify this. But right now, this patient's chest is open on my operating table. If I leave now, he will die. Is that what you want?" The heart monitor's beeping seemed to grow louder in the tense silence that followed. The third officer whispered something to his colleagues, but they shook their heads. A surgical resident who had been observing the operation slipped out of the room, presumably to alert hospital administration. The team continued working, trying to maintain their focus despite the unprecedented interruption. "Look at the patient's charts," the surgeon suggested calmly, still performing the delicate procedure. "Check the hospital records, make your calls, but I cannot and will not abandon my patient in the middle of open-heart surgery. That would violate every oath I've taken as a doctor." The officers huddled near the door, speaking in hushed tones. The lead officer made several phone calls, his voice barely audible over the medical equipment's steady hum. Minutes ticked by like hours. The surgical team tried to maintain their routine, passing instruments, monitoring vitals, but the presence of 3 armed officers in their operating room cast a heavy shadow over every movement. One of the nurses noticed the patient's blood pressure fluctuating slightly and adjusted the medications accordingly. This subtle change seemed to remind everyone in the room what was really at stake, not a police warrant or a case of mistaken identity, but a human life. The surgeon continued his work with remarkable composure, his movements precise and focused despite the extraordinary circumstances. His voice remained steady as he requested instruments and gave instructions to his team. Through the operating room's windows, movement could be seen in the hallway. Hospital administrators and security personnel had gathered, engaged in intense discussions with more police officers who had arrived as backup. The chief of surgery burst into the room, properly gowned and masked this time. "Officers, I've contacted your precinct captain. We're working to sort this out, but you need to step out of the operating room immediately. You're violating multiple health and safety protocols." The tension reached its peak as the lead officer seemed to weigh his options. The surgeon remained focused on his patient, his hands steady as ever, though beads of sweat had formed on his forehead beneath his surgical cap. "This is about more than just protocols," the chief of surgery continued. "Every second you remain in here puts this patient at greater risk of infection. We have a man's life on the line." Finally, the lead officer nodded slightly. "We'll wait outside. But don't think about trying to leave," he added, pointing at the surgeon. As the officers filed out, the operating room seemed to collectively exhale, but everyone knew this was far from over. The surgery still needed to be completed, and beyond those doors, a storm was brewing that would soon capture national attention. The surgeon looked around at his team, his eyes conveying both determination and appreciation. "Let's focus on our patient," he said simply, returning his full attention to the delicate procedure at hand. "He's all that matters right now." Little did anyone know that just outside the operating room, events were unfolding that would completely change the course of this already extraordinary morning. Outside the operating room, the hospital corridors had transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. The chief of surgery stood toe-to-toe with the police officers, his surgical mask pulled down to his chin as he spoke in heated but hushed tones. Hospital staff hurried past, stealing glances at the unusual gathering of law enforcement at the OR doors. "This is completely unprecedented," the chief argued, his face flushed with frustration. "Do you understand what you've done by entering a sterile operating room? The patient could develop a life-threatening infection." The lead officer maintained his stern demeanor, but uncertainty had begun to creep into his expression. "We're following protocol based on a serious assault complaint. The description matches your surgeon perfectly." Meanwhile, inside the operating room, the tension was palpable. The surgical team worked with renewed focus, knowing their patient's life hung by a thread. The heart monitor's steady beeping provided a rhythm to their movements, a reminder of their purpose despite the chaos unfolding around them. The surgeon's hands remained steady as he carefully manipulated the delicate heart tissue. "Suction here, please," he requested calmly, as if armed officers hadn't just threatened to arrest him mid-surgery. A nurse quickly complied, her hands just as steady as his. Back in the hallway, the hospital's legal team had arrived, their formal attire standing out among the sea of scrubs and police uniforms. The hospital administrator, a tall woman with graying hair, immediately took charge of the situation. "Officers, we're pulling security footage from last night right now," she announced. "Our surgeon was here performing emergency surgeries until well past midnight. We have documentation, witnesses, and video evidence." The lead officer's radio crackled to life. After a brief exchange, his face noticeably paled. "Central, please repeat that last message," he requested, stepping away from the group. Inside the OR, the surgeon was approaching the most critical part of the procedure. "Beginning the valve replacement now," he announced to his team. The concentration in the room was intense, everyone acutely aware that one small mistake could be fatal. One of the younger nurses noticed the surgeon's forehead glistening with sweat more than usual. Without being asked, she gently dabbed it with a sterile cloth. The small gesture spoke volumes about the team's unity in this crisis. The hospital administrator's voice could be heard through the OR doors, growing more insistent. "Your precinct just called to inform you they've apprehended someone matching the actual description of your suspect on the other side of town." The revelation sent ripples through the gathered crowd. The officers huddled together, speaking in urgent whispers. Their confident demeanor had crumbled, replaced by visible discomfort and embarrassment. Inside the OR, the surgeon remained focused on his patient, though his ears caught fragments of the conversation outside. His team worked around him with practiced precision, each person performing their role flawlessly despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Valve is responding well," the surgeon announced, his voice carrying its usual calm authority. "Vitals stable. We're going to start closing soon." The chief of surgery re-entered the OR, properly scrubbed and gowned this time. "How's our patient?" he asked, moving to observe the procedure. "He's doing well," the surgeon replied, not looking up from his work. Despite the unexpected interruption, outside, the police officers were now facing the full force of the hospital's administrative and legal team. The hospital administrator's voice was clear and firm. "We will be filing a formal complaint about this incident. Your actions today put a patient's life at risk and violated numerous medical protocols." The lead officer, now visibly shaken, tried to maintain some authority. "We were following procedure based on the information we had at the time." "Following procedure?" The chief of surgery scoffed, having stepped out momentarily. "By storming into a sterile operating room during open-heart surgery. Based on what?" A vague description and assumptions. The younger police officer shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we've received confirmation that we have the actual suspect in custody. It appears there was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" The hospital administrator's voice was sharp. This misunderstanding could have cost someone their life, not to mention the complete disregard for proper medical procedure and the obvious racial profiling involved in this incident. Inside the OR, the surgeon was beginning to close the patient's chest. His movements remained precise and careful, showing no signs of the stress he must have been feeling. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm, a reassuring sound that reminded everyone that despite everything, they were succeeding in their primary mission, saving a life. "Final sutures now," the surgeon announced. His team moved in perfect synchronization, their earlier fear replaced by determined professionalism. They had faced an unprecedented challenge and maintained their focus throughout. As the surgery drew to a close, no one in that operating room knew that this incident would soon become a national talking point, sparking important conversations about bias, professionalism, and the intersection of law enforcement and healthcare. But for now, they'd focused on their patient, whose steady vital signs were the only validation they needed. As the confrontation in the hallway intensified, the hospital administrator took control of the situation with the precision of a seasoned professional. Her years of experience managing crisis situations were evident in every calculated move she made. "Let me be absolutely clear about what happened here today," she addressed the police officers, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "Your officers burst into a sterile operating room during a critical heart surgery, risking a patient's life, based on nothing more than a vague description and hasty assumptions." The hospital's legal team had set up an impromptu command center in a nearby conference room. They were rapidly gathering evidence. Security footage from the previous night showing the surgeon working late, staff testimonials, and medical records documenting his presence during emergency surgeries. Inside the operating room, the atmosphere remained focused but tense. The surgeon continued his work with unwavering concentration, his hands steady as he navigated the final delicate stages of the procedure. The patient's vital signs had remained stable throughout the ordeal, a testament to the team's professionalism under pressure. Blood pressure holding steady, the anesthesiologist reported, his voice calm and clear. Oxygen saturation excellent. The chief of surgery moved between the OR and the hallway, serving as a bridge between the medical team and the growing crowd of hospital officials and law enforcement officers outside. Each time he entered the OR, he followed proper sterilization protocols, a pointed contrast to the officer's earlier breach. Outside, more hospital staff had gathered, drawn by the unprecedented situation. Whispers spread through the corridors, and phones discreetly captured videos of the unfolding scene. Social media was already beginning to buzz with early accounts of what had happened. The lead officer's radio crackled again, this time with confirmation that made him visibly uncomfortable. The actual suspect had not only been arrested, but had already confessed to the assault at the pharmacy. The description that had led them to the hospital had been vague at best, and the decision to storm the OR was looking increasingly indefensible. "Sir," the youngest officer addressed his superior, "should we contact the captain about this situation?" "The captain is already aware," the hospital administrator interjected. "In fact, he's on his way here now. He's as concerned about your actions as we are." Meanwhile, in the OR, the surgery was entering its final phases. The surgeon's voice remained steady as he guided his team through the closing procedures. "Final check on the valve function. Everything looks good. Let's begin closing up." The scrub nurse handed him each instrument with precision, their years of working together evident in their seamless coordination. The tension in the room had transformed into a focused determination to complete the surgery successfully, despite the extraordinary circumstances. A young resident who had been observing the surgery couldn't help but whisper to a colleague, "I've never seen anything like this." The way he stayed so calm. The hospital's head of security arrived with a thick folder of documents. "We have complete documentation of the surgeon's whereabouts last night," he announced to the gathering in the hallway, including time-stamped security footage and electronic key card records. He never left the hospital. The lead officer was now facing the full consequences of his hasty decision. The hospital administrator continued, "Your officers compromised a sterile environment, risked a patient's life, and demonstrated a shocking lack of judgment. All because you couldn't be bothered to verify basic facts before taking such drastic action." Inside the OR, the surgeon was placing the final sutures. Despite the sweat on his brow and the tension in his shoulders, his hands never wavered. The heart monitor's steady beeping remained a constant reminder of what was truly at stake. "Closing successful," he announced. "Vital signs remain stable. We did it, team." The relief in the room was palpable, though no one relaxed completely. They still had to get through the critical immediate post-operative period, and the chaos outside showed no signs of settling. As the surgical team began their post-operation procedures, the chief of surgery returned to the OR. "Excellent work," he said, looking directly at the surgeon. "How are you holding up?" The surgeon finally allowed himself a small sigh. "I'm fine. How's our patient's family doing? They must be worried sick after all this commotion." This simple question, showing concern for his patient's family even after what he'd just endured, spoke volumes about his character. The chief of surgery made a mental note to include this detail in the official report that would surely follow. Outside, the hospital administrator was already planning the next steps. This incident couldn't be swept under the rug. It raised too many important questions about law enforcement procedures, racial bias, and patient safety. As she coordinated with the legal team, she knew this story was far from over. The truth began unfolding with remarkable speed. In the hospital's security office, a team was reviewing footage from every angle, building an airtight timeline of events. The evidence was clear and undeniable. "Look here," the security chief pointed to a screen showing footage from the previous night. "Our surgeon was in operating room 3 from 8 p.m. until almost 2 a.m., handling an emergency case. Then he's seen in the doctor's lounge for a short break before being called to another emergency at 2:30 a.m. The police captain had arrived, his face stern as he watched the footage. The alleged assault at the pharmacy had occurred at 9:45 p.m., when the surgeon was clearly visible in the operating room, saving another patient's life. Meanwhile, across town, the real perpetrator was providing a full confession. The description that had led police to the hospital had been nothing more than a tall man in professional clothes, a description so vague it could have matched hundreds of people in the city. Back at the hospital, the patient from the interrupted surgery was being moved to recovery. His vital signs remained strong, a testament to the surgical team's skill under pressure. The surgeon walked alongside the bed, still monitoring his patient closely, refusing to let the morning's events distract him from his responsibilities. In the hospital's main conference room, an emergency meeting was underway. The hospital administrator sat at the head of the table, surrounded by legal representatives, board members, and senior medical staff. "This incident goes beyond a simple mistake," she stated firmly. "We had armed officers enter a sterile operating room during open-heart surgery. The implications are staggering." The hospital's head of public relations was already fielding calls from major news outlets. Word had spread quickly, and the story was catching fire on social media. Clips filmed by hospital staff were going viral, showing the tense standoff outside the operating room. The police captain stood before the group, his demeanor markedly different from his officer's earlier aggressive stance. "On behalf of the department, I want to express our deepest regrets. This should never have happened." "Regrets aren't enough," the chief of surgery interjected. "We need to talk about what this incident reveals about systemic issues in law enforcement. Our surgeon was targeted based on nothing more than a vague description, and let's be honest, racial profiling." The room fell silent as security footage played on a large screen, showing the officers' initial entry into the OR. The contrast between their forceful entrance and the careful, sterile procedures normally required in an operating room was stark. Down in the recovery room, the patient's family was finally able to see their loved one. The surgeon spoke with them briefly, explaining the procedure's success without mentioning the extraordinary circumstances under which it was completed. "Your father's new heart valve is functioning perfectly," he assured them, his calm demeanor giving no hint of the morning's drama. "The next 24 hours are critical, but I'm very optimistic about his recovery." Back in the conference room, the hospital's legal team was presenting a preliminary report. "We've documented multiple violations of medical protocol, patient safety regulations, and possibly civil rights laws," the lead attorney explained. "This isn't just about one incident, it's about preventing anything like this from happening again." The police captain listened intently, taking notes. His department was facing a major crisis, and he knew changes would need to be made. "We need to completely revise our procedures for interactions with medical facilities," he acknowledged. Social media was exploding with reactions to the story. Medical professionals from around the country were sharing their outrage, while civil rights activists were organizing protests. The incident was quickly becoming a symbol of larger societal issues. The hospital administrator looked at her phone, seeing notifications flood in from national news organizations requesting comments. She knew this story would have far-reaching implications for both healthcare and law enforcement policies. "We need to be transparent about what happened here," she announced to the room. "This isn't just about our hospital or our surgeon. This is about addressing systemic problems that put patients at risk and allow prejudice to override common sense." As the day progressed, more details emerged about the real suspect and his confession. The contrast between the initial description and the surgeon couldn't have been more stark, making the officer's actions appear even more questionable. The surgeon, having completed his post-operative duties, finally took a moment to sit in his office. He looked at his phone, seeing dozens of missed calls and messages. The story had grown far beyond anything he could have imagined when he walked into the hospital that morning. The surgeon, having completed his post-operative duties, finally took a moment to sit in his office. He looked at his phone, seeing dozens of missed calls and messages. The story had grown far beyond anything he could have imagined when he walked into the hospital that morning. The sixth part of the story unfolded in the late afternoon as the hospital buzzed with a mixture of tension and triumph. The surgeon's patient was recovering well in the ICU, his vital signs strong and stable despite the morning's unprecedented interruption. In his office, the surgeon finally allowed himself to process the day's events. His white coat hung neatly on the door, and he sat at his desk, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The room was quiet except for the gentle hum of his computer and occasional footsteps in the hallway outside. "Doctor," his assistant knocked softly before entering. "The patient's latest tests just came back. Everything looks perfect." She paused, then added, "And there are several news crews in the lobby asking to speak with you." The surgeon nodded thoughtfully. He'd spent his entire career avoiding the spotlight, focusing solely on his work and his patients. Now, circumstances had thrust him into the center of a national conversation he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. "Tell them I'll speak to them tomorrow," he replied. "Right now, my priority is monitoring my patient's recovery." Meanwhile, the hospital's PR team was working overtime in a conference room turned makeshift media center. Phones rang constantly as reporters from across the country sought comments on the story. Social media had exploded with hashtags supporting the surgeon and condemning the police action. The chief of surgery stopped by the surgeon's office, carrying a thick folder. "The hospital board just finished their emergency meeting," he said, settling into a chair. "They're implementing new security protocols immediately. No law enforcement will be allowed to enter any medical area without proper authorization and following strict procedures." Outside the hospital, a crowd had gathered. Medical students from nearby universities stood with signs supporting the surgeon and patient rights. Local community leaders gave interviews to news crews, speaking about the broader implications of the morning's events. Back in the ICU, the patient's family sat by his bedside, unaware of the growing storm their loved one's surgery had sparked. They were focused solely on his recovery, grateful for every steady beep of the heart monitor. The surgeon made his rounds, checking on his other patients while keeping a close eye on his post-operative case. His colleagues watched him with a mixture of admiration and concern, amazed at his composure after such an ordeal. In the police department across town, an internal investigation was already underway. The officers involved had been placed on administrative leave, and the police chief was facing tough questions about training and protocol. "Your actions today were completely unacceptable," the police chief addressed the officers in a closed-door meeting. "You put a patient's life at risk and violated multiple protocols. This incident will lead to major changes in how we operate." As evening approached, the surgeon received an unexpected visitor, the hospital's most senior board member, a retired surgeon himself. The elderly man entered the office quietly, his face grave. "I've been practicing medicine for over 40 years, the board member said, "and I've never seen anything like what happened today. The way you handled it, well, you showed what it truly means to be a doctor." The surgeon remained modest. "I just focused on my patient. That's what any doctor would do." But not every doctor could have maintained that level of focus and precision with armed officers threatening to arrest them, the board member replied. "You turned a potentially tragic situation into a powerful statement about medical ethics and professionalism." As night fell, the surgeon finally prepared to head home. The halls were quieter now, though news vans still dotted the parking lot. His patient was stable, his family grateful, and his team proud of their performance under pressure. Before leaving, he made one final stop at the ICU. The patient was sleeping peacefully, his new heart valve working perfectly. The surgeon checked the monitors, adjusted the blanket, and quietly spoke with the night shift nurses. Walking to his car, he reflected on how a routine surgery had become a catalyst for change. Tomorrow would bring interviews, meetings, and difficult conversations about bias and protocol. But tonight, he could take satisfaction in knowing that despite everything, he had stayed true to his most important duty, saving his patient's life. In the weeks following the incident, the impact of that extraordinary morning rippled far beyond the hospital walls. The story had captured national attention, sparking important conversations about healthcare, law enforcement, and social justice. The surgeon's patient made a remarkable recovery. 1 month after the surgery, he walked out of the hospital on his own, surrounded by his beaming family. The successful outcome seemed to underscore the importance of what had happened that day, how close they had come to a very different result. News channels picked up the story, featuring interviews with hospital staff who had witnessed the events. The young nurse who had been in the operating room spoke eloquently about the surgeon's composure. He never lost focus, not for a second, she told reporters. It was like watching a master class in professionalism under pressure. The hospital took decisive action in response to the incident. New protocols were established for law enforcement interactions with medical facilities. Every entrance now displayed clear guidelines about proper procedures for police entering the hospital. Training sessions were conducted to ensure all staff knew how to handle similar situations. The police department faced its own reckoning. The incident led to a complete overhaul of their procedures for serving warrants in medical facilities. Sensitivity training became mandatory, and new guidelines required thorough verification of suspects before any action could be taken. "We failed that day," the police chief admitted in a press conference. "But we're committed to learning from this mistake and making sure it never happens again." The surgeon himself became an unexpected advocate for change. Though naturally private, he recognized the importance of speaking up. He began giving talks at medical conferences about maintaining professional focus under extreme circumstances. His calm demeanor and thoughtful insights made him a powerful voice for reform. At a national medical convention, he shared his experience. "In that moment, I had two choices: give in to fear and anger, or stay focused on my patient. As doctors, our first duty will always be to preserve life." The hospital created a new training program using the incident as a case study in medical ethics and crisis management. Medical students from across the country studied how the surgical team had handled the situation, learning valuable lessons about maintaining composure under pressure. The patient's family became vocal supporters of healthcare workers' rights. "We almost lost our father because of prejudice and poor judgment," the patient's daughter told a newspaper. "But we got to keep him because a dedicated surgeon refused to abandon his post." 6 months after the incident, the hospital hosted a symposium on healthcare and social justice. Medical professionals, law enforcement officials, and community leaders came together to discuss ways to prevent similar incidents and promote better understanding between different sectors of society. The surgeon kept a low profile despite his growing influence. He continued his regular surgical schedule, treating every patient with the same dedication and skill. His colleagues noticed that younger doctors often sought his advice, not just about medical procedures, but about handling difficult situations with grace. 1 year after the incident, the patient returned for a checkup. His heart was strong, his recovery complete. As he sat in the examination room with the surgeon, he expressed his gratitude not just for the successful operation, but for standing firm that day. "You didn't just save my life," the patient said. "You showed everyone what real courage looks like." The surgeon's response was characteristic of his humble nature: "I was just doing my job." But if what happened that day helps create positive change, then something good came from a difficult situation. The story became part of medical school curricula nationwide, teaching future doctors about maintaining professional ethics under pressure. Law enforcement academies used it to teach about the importance of thorough investigation and the dangers of hasty judgment. As the surgeon left the hospital that evening, he passed a new plaque in the lobby. It didn't mention him by name, but its message was clear: in honor of those who stand firm in their duty to preserve life, no matter the circumstances. The incident had changed policies, challenged assumptions, and inspired reforms. But perhaps its most lasting impact was the simple yet powerful reminder that in the face of prejudice and pressure, staying true to one's principles can make all the difference. The surgeon still performs surgeries at the hospital, still saves lives with steady hands and unwavering focus. But now he carries with him the knowledge that sometimes doing your job well can create ripples that change the world.